Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. I've heard that passage so many times in my life, and I have to say that often people like to say it, I know what will help. Often people like to say it when I'm in the middle of a trial or one of those nasty points in my life, and my reaction is often, I want to punch them in the face. Like, really? Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. Sounds absolutely crazy, but James is on to something with that. And I was thinking about that a little bit. It's not a platitude. It's not just one of those things that you say that's supposed to make somebody feel better, even though most of those never make anybody feel better. James really knew what he was talking about. He and his friends and all of the people that he was writing to and saying this to, they're not people who were unfamiliar with trials. In fact, James was martyred for his faith, probably not that long after he wrote this. And he saw the writing on the wall, knew that was coming. So this isn't coming from a person who had small little trials. This was a really substantial thing. So that's what I want to talk about today. When Brandon asked me to speak, and I knew it was the new year, one of the things that's just been on my heart lately is thinking about how do we build resilience and endurance in a culture that has absolutely no space for any of that. I was thinking about that. Our culture is so filled with like instant gratification. You're on Instagram, you're standing in line, you don't even wait anymore in line, you just immediately get on your phone and just constantly filled. And I think that we have all of these crazy expectations. I was just kind of thinking about what my story looks like, and one of the big pieces that I realized is that I grew up in the 80s and the early 90s, and that was probably the point in all of human history where we had the most wealth. We might get there again, we might not ever get there again, but there were expectations that you could have a really comfortable life, you'd be doing better than your parents, you'd be doing better than any other generation before you, and you could have everything you want, like adventure, excitement. You could be an English major and have a fantastic job, and all of those things I was told. World has actually turned out slightly different from that. But I was thinking about the stories that I hear when I talk to you guys. And so I'm going to massively oversimplify some of your stories. Don't be offended by that. I'll do it to my story later. But a few stories that I've heard. One story goes something along the lines of this, that I grew up in probably a Christian home. Maybe I had a really stable living environment. Maybe I didn't. But I wasn't like everybody else. And I wasn't like what the church expected of me, that I had feelings that made me different. And so there came a point in time where I had to choose, what am I going to do? Am I going to choose to try to fit myself into a box that I don't fit into? Or am I going to let everybody know who I really am? And both of those paths don't seem to lead to a point of crisis, a point where you have to face the fact that you're different. And that often, from what I'm hearing from everybody, seems to involve rejection. Sometimes rejection by your family, often rejection by your church, rejection by the world sometimes. And it's not fun. And it sounds like it leads a lot of people into years of just like bumps in the road and isolation. What's really cool is I hear a lot of stories where people find reconciliation at the end. And maybe reconciliation is this long process that continues. Another story that I hear really commonly in our church is a story of loss. I've heard from a lot of people who probably invested in a house in San Diego in like 2006, that loss was financial. And maybe you lost everything that you earned, everything that you owned. I know a few people who lost houses that they spent 20, 30 years trying to build equity in, and now it's all gone, and you got to start over from scratch later in your life. Probably much more painful is if that loss is human. It could be a spouse, it could be a child, someone that you hold dear. And how do you recover from that? I don't know. I've not experienced that one. Another loss or story narrative that I've heard a lot is that you never actually had a thing. It's not like you had some major event where you had to focus something. It's like in the absence of an event. And this is a story that I see a lot in my friend group especially. I waited until I was at the end of my 30s to get married, and so I have a lot of girlfriends who are finding themselves really close to 40 or over that 40 mark where maybe you're not going to have kids if you don't get married now, and it's this loss of a dream. I thought my life was going to look like this, and now I realize it's not. And frequently that type of loss, whether it's that story or maybe it's mental illness, or it could be shame, it could be a body image related thing. Whatever it is, I've gotten to a point where I thought the life was going to go this way, and it's not. And I don't know what to do with that. So kind of what I'm trying to get at here is there's so many different narratives out there, and I encourage you to talk to the person sitting next to you, or maybe the person who's sitting like 4 rows behind you that you don't know, and hear their story. And there's probably going to be lots of those moments where something's unexpected and it deviates from where you want life to go. And that's what makes a good story. If all of us had a story and the story was just like, this good thing happened to me, and then this good thing happened to me, and then this good thing happened to me, you would not like that person. You wouldn't want to hang out with that person. And part of that is because I think there's something wired into humanity to understand that life isn't all rosy and that there's lots of bumps in the road. And it's just the experience of humanity in a broken world. So that's what James is talking about. He's not talking to people who live that rosy, boring life. He's talking to real people who are experiencing real trials. And yet he says, consider it pure joy. So what is James talking about, the book of James? Well, let's first start with who is James. James is Jesus' brother. What does that mean? I don't know. I tried to Google this to see if there seems to be consensus, and people say James is Jesus' brother. Some people seem to say that that's like his cousin, maybe his half-brother, maybe his full brother. It doesn't really matter. I think what we know is that James had access to Jesus' family, Jesus' growing up life. He was probably there through a lot of it. He also got to see Jesus' ministry years, and then we also know that he became one of the apostles later on, and so he was actively engaged in the early church. So James is coming from a lot of authority. He knows what he's talking about when it comes to what Jesus went through and who Jesus is, probably better than most anybody else. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And then, so what is James saying in this teeny tiny little book in the middle of the end of the Bible? He's really saying that he wants to dive into your business. He wants to get into your life and all the nastiness and challenge how you live. He also seems to be challenging a lot of probably misperceptions about what Christianity really is in those early years of the church. So I'm going to read the first chapter, most of the first chapter of James. Keep in mind that this isn't a story. Recently, I heard someone explain that the way that their brain works is there's just 50 million thoughts that all want to come out of the mouth all at the same time. And she was saying it's just really hard for me to speak eloquently because they all just come out all at once. And I kind of feel like that's what happened to James. So it's not a story. It's more of a whole bunch of really great ideas kind of compiled together. So bear with it. It's a bit like Proverbs or something like that. So James, a servant of God and the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations. Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. If any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to him. But when he asks, he must believe and not doubt, because he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That man should not think he will receive anything from the Lord. He's double-minded, unstable in all he does. The brother in humble circumstances ought to take pride in his high position, but the one who is rich should take pride in his low position, because he will pass away like a wildflower. For the sun rises with scorching heat and withers the plant. Its blossoms fall and its beauty is destroyed. In the same way, the rich man will fade away even while he goes about his business. Blessed is the man who perseveres under trial, because when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life that God has promised to all who love him. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when by his own evil desire he is dragged away and enticed. Then after his desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Don't be deceived, my dear brothers. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like the shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we may be a kind of first fruits of all that he created. If anyone considers himself religious and yet does not keep a tight rein on his tongue, he deceives himself, and his religion is worthless. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after the orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Amen. So, what is James talking about here? He's talking about a whole list of things, but the theme that kind of unites and ties the entire book of James together is this concept of how do you live a life of wholeness? And he contrasts that with somebody who's kind of tossed and turned like the waves of the sea. I think a more modern illustration of that is those like windsock people that you see at the front of car dealerships and stuff like that. So that's what I keep picturing as I'm reading James. How do I not be one of those windsock people? I think another way that you can describe that is what is a life well lived? And that's what James is really trying to get at. He also spends quite a bit of time talking about some course correction. And he mentions what is true religion and kind of relies really heavily on everything that Jesus said and the whole history of God and people that you see in the Old Testament before that. So James isn't bringing up anything new. He's not introducing any new theology in this book. He's just trying to shout out a few things that he feels like his community and this emerging church needs to hear. So I'm going to summarize the book of James really quickly, and this is just my summary. I don't think that it's a summary that anybody else is really writing about, but I read a few people who are much more researched than me to kind of put this together. So I think the first thing that I would list in the book of James is a set of tips for a life well lived. And one of them is building patience and endurance. He focuses a lot on that you need to figure out how do you go into the world and when you hit a bump, not have it send you in a totally different direction or have it make you want to change what you know about who God is so that it fits this new perspective of the way that the world works. Instead, he's thinking, how do we as a community build people who have the ability to go through life with patience and endurance and run the long race? A way that he talks about doing that is choosing joy, seeing joy not as this feeling that can kind of come and go based on your circumstances, but joy instead being an attitude and something that you choose intentionally and cultivate through the way that you live your life. He also spends a lot of time talking about making sure that your hope is in the right place. And again, that goes back to, do you really know who Jesus is? Do you really know who God is? We've luckily got the Bible, which is a set of stories over a long period of history that is a good source for us to go back to see, is what I'm hearing from the church, is what I'm hearing from society around me, does that really square with everything that I know from what the Bible teaches about who Jesus is, who God is? And if not, maybe I should let that go, because a lot of what James gets at is these kind of false beliefs that creep up and take us away from where we really should be. So some of the things that he calls out is don't chase wealth. Wealth is fleeting. He talks about don't lean towards favoritism, and especially don't give the good seat in the front of the church to the wealthiest person. That's just wrong. It's not who the church should be. We shouldn't be prioritizing money and power and status. We should be people who, like God called us to be, looking for who are the poor and the marginalized in our community and giving them equal status. He even goes so far as to say that poverty could be a blessing. And he's not the first to say that. Jesus said that too. Poverty can be a blessing. Not that poverty is great, because it really is terrible. It's usually the lack of the ability to live a good life and adds a lot of stress. And poverty is bad. I don't need to tell you about that. But what James says is that poverty can be a gift because it forces you to trust God. And he contrasts that with wealth, which forces you to be self-sufficient and selfish. So again, he says, seek out wisdom so that you can know the real God, the real true Jesus. And then that leads me to the second piece. The first is a set of tips. The second piece is kind of redefining what is true religion. So at the end of the first chapter, he says, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after the orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted or stained by the world. So the first piece of that, look after orphans and widows, that echoes the entire history of the way that God deals with humanity. This is really, really, really important. There seems to be a lot of controversy over, is James saying, well, you need to have faith and deeds? Do you have to earn your way to God? And that's not at all what James is saying. What James is saying is, if your faith exists without action, if you say, I have this strong-rooted faith in Jesus and I'm following Jesus, and yet you're living the way of the world and you're only wanting to hang out with really wealthy people and your best friends are the Kardashians, and you don't look at the people on the outsides, the margins of society, you probably aren't actually being transformed by your faith. So something's probably false there. That true religion involves action, and it involves a lot of mercy and a desire for justice. Right. He also says, don't let the world stain you. And I think that's another thing that sometimes people are really kind of worried about. Does this mean that I have to pretend to be the perfect church person? No, I don't think that that's that, unless the perfect church person is actually something that Jesus is describing. Don't allow the world to change your religion. Don't allow the world to try to make you something that God or Jesus wouldn't want you to be, hasn't created you to be. And so he lists a few things. What does that look like in James's culture? These are probably ways that people were deviating or wanting to incorporate their culture into their faith. So he says no favoritism. Talked about that a little bit already. Don't try to make your church powerful by bringing the right people in. I mean, that's probably not the end of the world, but it's not something that the church should be doing. And if that's what your goal is in the church, you are deviating from true faith. Don't just believe, but actually do. Again, if your belief isn't causing action, you might want to relook at that belief and see if it's actually grounded in truth. He talks about watching your words. Seems to feel very strongly that maybe words, the things that we say, might be the last thing that we're good at managing in terms of self-control. So we might have a lot of self-control in other areas, but yet we let our words slip and we cause a lot of damage, say mean things to people, divide. So he says, really carefully listen before you speak. He also talks about wisdom. True wisdom doesn't equal selfish ambition or envy. So if your religion seems to be focused on helping you stay secure, maybe, that's a big thing I think in our culture, that I want to be safe, I want to be secure, I want to prevent myself from ever experiencing those hard things in life, that's probably selfish, and that's probably not the way of Jesus. If it's, I want to have the nice house, I want to have the nice clothes, if that's where your wisdom is leading you, you might want to check that. Because selfish ambition and envy are not things that the gospel has as an end goal. James talks about choosing God and not wealth. It's a big theme that he mentions over and over and over again. He talks about being patient while waiting, and I think that's a really interesting thing to think about, that our posture here on earth is we're people who are in this spot where the world around us isn't perfect. It's got a lot of trials, a lot of trouble. It doesn't look like the way that God really wanted the world to be, and yet we know that God can make everything right and will make everything right. And we've been given this promise that one day all of that will be dealt with and God will restore the world to this perfect place where his view of goodness rules. So we're waiting in anticipation for the coming of Jesus again. We're waiting in anticipation for God to kind of step into our own individual lives and make things whole. And then the last thing he talks about, pray with expectation. That's often hard to do, especially in those moments where I've hit a bump in the road and now I have to reframe the whole way that I see everything. I think that going back to the Psalms is a great thing to do in those moments, and you see that David, who wrote most of the Psalms, spent a lot of time saying, God, I'm really ticked off at you right now, and where are you? And that's okay. So I invite you to try that if you're in one of those moments, to just bring it to God. God is here and he's willing to speak with us through prayer. So I kind of want to stop for a second and talk about my life and how I think about the book of James in terms of my experiences, just because I now nitpicked a few other stories out here. But I was thinking about my life and how, I told you I grew up in this moment of wealth and was told that you can study anything you want, you could go do anything you want, and you'll still have comfort and security, and you could still be famous or whatever it is that you're desiring. And so I graduated I would call myself a really early millennial. When I look at it, it's like, wow, I'm a stereotype. It's kind of funny. But I graduated and I had this desire. I wanted to go see the world. I wanted adventure and excitement. And while I'm at it, I want to do something really good that actually changes people's lives. And I want to get paid for it. And that was my, I can do this. And crazy enough, I did. and so I was really lucky in that way that I got to live all over the world. When I think about what would the Instagram version of my life look like, it would probably rock, because I lived in the Caribbean for a while. I lived in Africa for a long time. I lived in Asia for a little bit. I saw India for a long time. I got to work on a bunch of different really pressing issues: global warming, human trafficking, poverty, rural poverty, finance issues. I hopefully helped a few people along the way, and so the Instagram version of my life looks awesome. I learned somewhere along the way that don't do Instagram if that's the life you're living, because you won't have any friends in the end of it. And so I've never really done that, but I've thought about it a lot. And I think part of why some of those social media things can be a divide between actual relationships is because when I put those pictures up and I show, look at this cool thing that I'm doing right now, and look at this cool way that I'm helping people, and it shows a false narrative. So that's the Instagram version of my story. The real version of my story goes something more along the lines of this. I graduated, got a job, and never paid enough. I spent a lot of time just trying to figure out how to survive in really expensive cities, and then finally I got an opportunity to take a job overseas, and that was my end goal, and so I took it. But the only reason they offered it to me is because nobody else in their right mind would take it, and so I ended up, for a series of probably about 10 years, kind of traveling from one place to the next place to the next place by myself, alone, often with nobody that I could tell my story to who could relate. And so really socially isolated. And I had a whole series of really abusive bosses and some really nasty work environments. And so I think of what would the real version of that story look like, and it involved a lot of pain and a lot of isolation and a lot of times where I found myself trying to figure out how can I make this situation better, and frequently thinking about James and endurance, I was kind of like that wind man, that I would try something and I try something else and I try something else and I try to figure out how can I just be happy in the midst of so much social isolation and hardship. And it sounds really stupid for me to call that hardship because I've seen so much worse hardship than anything that I experienced, but that's what life is like. So when I look back on my life, I see moments where I was strong and I was really able to be this picture of endurance and patience that James talks about, where I was focused on God and I was focused on chasing, and I was very clear in understanding that this thing that I'm going through right now is something that's going to make me stronger and healthier. And those were often moments when I had some help. So it was usually when I had a really good friend around that could kind of join me in what I was going through, and someone who could experience it with me and help me stay focused on understanding who God is. And then there's other moments in my life where I really don't want to tell those stories because it's kind of embarrassing. And I did things that led me away from God and in a direction that actually made those troubles and trials much harder. So I think what I've been thinking about a lot is that the type of thing that you see when you look at people like James or some of the other early Christians is that they were so rooted in expectation and so rooted in truth and knowledge of Jesus and this awesome God that stuck them into terrible situations where a lot of them were killed and a lot of them were kicked out of cities and beat up. If you read Acts, it's just a series of Paul going from place to place to place, and in half the places he goes, he gets beat up and kicked out of town. And then in the end of it, he gets killed. And so that's what life looked like for some of those early Christians, but yet they were filled with joy, and they were filled with hope and with expectation. And I think that in our culture, it's so easy to forget that the truth that those early Christians experienced is still true. It's still here and present today. And so I think that what it means to be a radical Christian in our world is to be so completely different than the way that our culture expects us to be, that we can walk into hardship and we can consider it joy. We can understand that this moment that I'm going through is natural. It's part of the human story. It's part of the story that God is working, that's going to be beautiful and going to have a wonderful ending someday. And that this thing that I'm feeling right now, whatever type of pain it is, whether it's in your story, my story, someone else's story, this thing can be turned into something beautiful that draws me really close to God. So I kind of want to talk about a few things, but I think one of the themes here is that what I love about James is he doesn't gloss over those hard moments. He dives in and he course corrects. He says, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, but he dives into those hard moments and understands that those hard moments are often what create us to be people who are whole and complete. So I want to leave you with a few practical things, kind of like James did, a few tips on how to make it in our culture. And I think the first tip is to learn how to wait. And that sounds kind of weird, but what I mean is actively wait and not passively wait. I think that we're waiting for something hopeful. We're waiting for Jesus again. We're waiting maybe through this really rough patch for the beauty that comes on the end. But I don't mean just sit on your butt and be okay with whatever's coming your way. What I mean is actively waiting, and what that means is looking back in order to look forward. So look back at the history of God and humanity and remember. Just make a discipline out of remembering God's faithfulness in the past. You can look at your own life. You can remember the times when God was faithful to you. If you don't feel like you've got any of those, you can remember the times that God was faithful to people around you, or you could just read the Bible and look at all the times that God was faithful and showed up to people throughout the Bible. I've got a million stories of that. If you ever want to ask me, when has God been faithful in your life? I think about that all the time. One of the biggest is just after so many years where I was just alone and thinking, am I always going to be alone? God plopped Drew into my life, and now I've got a Drew and a Henry. And it's just this wonderful gift that I never thought I would have. And so it's just really, really cool. And that's just one story, but there's all these moments in everybody's life. Anybody who's been following Jesus long enough to go through some bumps and then see the beauty at the end that are great for us to dwell on and think about. Another thing is just pray. Again, remember God always and call him out. If you're angry, call him out. That's right. And what you'll find is that oftentimes God seems to be really merciful. If you look at the stories of Jesus, Jesus is always talking to the outcasts. And he has so much empathy for people who are suffering. The times when Jesus stopped and performed a miracle that didn't seem to be in part of his greater plan or his structure of the day, they were always when he saw someone suffering. And when I listen to your stories, I hear Jesus showing up when you just needed it. So pray. Call him out. Let him be involved in whatever moment you're going through. Another tip is consider it pure joy. Figure out, how do you cultivate joy in the midst of these hard moments? What James meant there is, understand that these trials and temptations that you're going through right now, once you get through them, it's going to make it easier to do it again and again and again. And that kind of sounds like joy. It kind of sounds like, oh great, you're preparing me for a long road. But I think that those two are quite interrelated. And along the way, you can practice and kind of build this habit of cultivating joy. Some ways that make that easy are just to center yourself. So go to the beach if that's your thing. Watch the ocean kind of smash up on the cliffs and be filled with the wonder of the earth. Go to the mountains and just let yourself be amazed by the beauty of creation. There's a long history of people finding God in nature. And I think that it's one of the best ways to see God is to get out and just see his world. If it's not that, look for it in art. Listen to good music that just kind of gets your soul singing. Look for it in poetry, in really good stories. Whatever it is, there are ways to cultivate joy. And I think that any true joy cultivated could be through reading of the Bible. It could be through experiencing the world and just the wonder of the Creator who has enabled this all to be. But true joy is centered on something that connects you again to the Creator, to God. And seek it out, however you need to seek it out. So joy, again, it's not something that is tied to circumstances. It's not happiness. Joy is an attitude that you cultivate, often through a lot of hard work and intentionality. And it gets easier. It gets easier to do that the more that you practice it. And then a third tip is put your hope in the right spot. I think this is really, really, really important for us to think about. There are a lot of Christians preaching things that don't square with the Bible. Amen. Honestly, I think that God can speak through those people. So find wisdom in what they say, but make sure that what you're picking out is truth. And if you're ever questioning something that the church is teaching, go back to the Bible and say, does this square with these more researched primary documents that tell me really who Jesus is? Talk to people, pray, listen to the Holy Spirit. Is the Holy Spirit confirming what you're hearing? If the Holy Spirit is not confirming what you're hearing, then maybe go back to the Bible, check it again, talk to people. But reject false wisdom. Make sure that your hope is rooted in truth. Another thing I want to leave you with is 2 lies that I've seen over and over again. In especially American Christianity. The first lie is waiting on God means being okay with your present circumstances, whatever they may be. I don't think that is at all what I see when I read the Bible. Maybe in a moment. I had a moment in my early 20s where I had a job and I had a living environment, and it all just was like exhausting, and I felt like there was so much injustice happening around me, and I just wanted to run. My instinct was to run, and in that moment I was quite good at praying with discipline, and what I kept hearing was God say, no, stick this out. And then eventually he said, okay, it's time for you to go. So I'm just telling that as a story, that sometimes you might be hearing God say, wait, but that would be rare. Most of the time, you don't have to be okay with your present circumstances. God wants us to be people who fight for justice. He wants us to be people who fight for mercy. If the moment that you're in is abusive, you don't have to take it. You can wait on God. You can wait in expectation for God to restore creation to the way that it's supposed to look like. You can wait on God to make your life filled with His presence, but you don't have to take it if what you're experiencing is bad. And so that's just a lie that I think sometimes we get stuck in, that we're just supposed to be passive and we're not supposed to ever be people who embrace conflict. Now, there's always truth in that lie. James says, be careful with your words and make sure that what you want and what you're seeking is godly and not just something that's selfish, because that's equally as bad. Another thing he points out is God doesn't tempt us. So if what you're experiencing in your present circumstances is temptation to stray away from God or things that lead you towards God, get out of there. Put yourself back into a situation where it's easier to be filled with joy and patience and calmness. And it's not so easy. So it's never easy. Just kind of figure it out. But I just want to call out that lie, that I've heard that lie a lot, that as a Christian, you just need to be okay with everything, and that's not true. But remember, God can make anything beautiful. So if whatever experience you're going through, if it's tainted you or hurt you, or you feel like it's left you not as whole and complete as you were before, dwell in the joy that comes from knowing that God can turn anything broken into something beautiful. So a second lie that I feel like I hear all the time is waiting patiently for God means that everything will turn out great. I just want to go back to the point where I was talking about at the beginning. James was killed. Jesus was killed. And 11 of the 12 disciples were killed for their faith. So, yes, God is going to make everything turn out great. But if what you think is great isn't what God has in mind as great, you might want to check that a little bit. So if you're sitting and waiting, and you're just patient in this moment because you think that God's going to make you wealthy and powerful, God might do those things. He loves to bless people, but think about, is what you're waiting for God, or is it selfish ambition? Is it envy? Do you look at your neighbor and feel like, wow, they got it better than me? Ride in that. And be aware that what you're waiting for is not going to come out of selfishness or envy. It's going to come out of truth, and it's going to come out of wisdom that comes from knowledge of Jesus and who He actually is. So my last thing I just want to leave you with is James. He's really channeling Jesus, who's channeling God. They call us to live radically different, to not be like the world, to live in the world, to be here in community with our neighbors, to not be completely isolated, but to not allow the world to turn us into something that we shouldn't be, to not allow the world to cheapen us or stain us. That James is calling us to be totally different and to have the strength and endurance to go through life knowing that I'm part of a story that is so much more beautiful than anything I can imagine and anything I see today. Is it worth it? Absolutely. Is it going to be easy? No, probably not. I mean, maybe, but probably not. But in the end, we find real truth, and we find that peace that passes all understanding that comes through the knowledge of Jesus. Amen. We also see that once we find that truth, that faithful obedience to that walk, to that way of life, is the only way that we're going to achieve wholeness. It's the only way that we're going to be complete. It's the only way that we're not going to be blown around by these false promises that the world is full of. And it's the only way that we're going to be transformed. I think that's the last promise I want to leave you today with, is that when you're rooted in the truth, God changes you. And when you look back after many, many years, you find what James is talking about, that those moments of trial and those moments of tribulation, those hard things that you dealt with, have led you to a place where you're stronger, where you're better. So let God transform you, and let God make you into something much more beautiful. That's where I'm ending.